Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, would the Buddha see it as problematic if I were to feel a distaste for the indulgences of normal, everyday life?
What do you mean?
Knowing about impermanence, non-self, and dukkha, I look around and I see how much of the world is constituted of brief, deluded, or futile escapes, indulgences or diversions from the truth of things. Would the Buddha protest my viewing the world in this way?
I think that if you sought to remedy that distaste through sensory indulgence or deluded thinking of some kind, of course he would discourage that. However, you're speaking to a very important motivation that many feel that causes them to pursue the Buddha way. The Buddha himself saw the futility, the delusion, and the illusion in the conventional world around us, and that caused him to renounce. He certainly would not look upon you and, seeing the same thing, tell you that that was a bad thing.
I suppose you're right. I don't harbor ill will, hatred, or anger towards the indulgence of the world around me, but rather I am simply dissatisfied with them, and don't wish to seek them out, whatever they have to offer.
This is a very wholesome perspective indeed. May we all not only view things in this way, but also seek to help others see this way as well.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Great Doubt in Buddhism. What is the Great Doubt? How ought one cultivate it? Why ought one cultivate it? We hope you enjoy. So, what is the Great Doubt in Buddhism?
The Great Doubt is an important concept in Buddhism, particularly in the context of Zen practice and meditation. It refers to a particular mindset which can be cultivated in the course of one's practice and study. The word doubt in English is very vague, and it seems like it would actually be counterproductive to what we would want to cultivate in Buddhism. So I'll start with a discussion of doubt itself and its position in the scheme of Buddhist practice and study. In Buddhism, the Great Doubt is doubt in one's own deluded views that the whole world around us is permanent, free from emptiness, and free from dukkha. In Sanskrit, doubt is referred to as vicikitsa, and in Chinese, it is yi, and in Japanese, it is referred to as gi. When we think of doubt, we imagine it as this state wherein we are unsure, uncertain, or indecisive about something. This is typically regarded in everyday life as being a negative thing, an unpleasant state of mind. More specifically as well, certain kinds of doubt are also negative in Buddhism. One of the 5 hindrances to meditation practice is doubt in one's abilities or in the efficacy of the practice itself. Then commonly, we think the opposite of doubt would be faith. Faith in the scheme of Buddhist teachings is seen to be a very positive and necessary state of mind. We aren't talking about just any faith. When we say faith in the context of Buddhism, we're talking about shraddha, which is more akin to confidence. It's confidence that, even though you haven't done all of the mathematical proofs yourself, 2 plus 2 will still equal 4. Thus, we cannot call it blind faith, which we would tentatively define as a willful and persistent assertion that something is the case in the total absence of evidence. There's still a component of shraddha that lacks total verification in the immediate here and now, however. In the analogy I gave a second ago, you still haven't done the proofs yourself. You've just seen that 2 plus 2 equals 4 every time you do it. Therefore, shraddha is still the belief in something being the case in the event that one cannot be 1000% sure that it is the case. This is deeply related to the fallibility of our senses and experiences in the Buddhist scheme of thinking. Thus, we can conclude from this scheme that both faith and doubt are reactions to uncertainty.
I want to push back a little bit. When you say the opposite of doubt being faith, I would say the opposite of doubt is trust.
That's a good point to bring up, and often you'll see shraddha be translated as trust as well, because faith has become such a loaded term in a Judeo-Christian normative sort of scholarly setting about Buddhism. And that kind of speaks to the fact that it's not, like we say, blind faith. It's more trust that if you do the same thing over and over again, You'll get the same outcome over and over again, rather than some random, crazy, unexpected outcome. It's related to the relative continuity of causality that we can observe even in light of the truth of impermanence. So, the scheme of faith and doubt can be viewed in its most simple form and according to how it works in the most conventional sense. The great doubt in Buddhism relies on this scheme as a starting point, but it represents an interesting change of perspective. Doubt may be an unwholesome state of mind in many cases, but it can be sublimated into something very positive. In more specifically Buddhist terms, doubt can be a cause and condition for very positive outcomes. Let's go through the levels of doubt that we're talking about, and then we will discuss how they fit into the practical scheme of meditation and ritual. When one feels doubt in response to something, there are two possible reactions to that kind of doubt. I call these responses counting or discounting. Let's talk about discounting first. If somebody came up to you and made the claim that gravity does not exist, you would probably doubt that claim. In fact, you would discount that claim because it observably does exist. We are pulled towards objects with mass, and that pull is stronger for objects with greater mass. That's gravity, one of the four fundamental forces of the universe. Your doubt causes you to bounce off of that claim because you have verified knowledge contrary to that claim. However, there's another possible response, and that is counting. If somebody makes a much less obviously incorrect claim, especially if you have no direct verifiable knowledge contrary to that claim, your response might be instead to follow up on it. For example, if somebody were to walk up to me with my lack of mathematical knowledge and say that 1,729 is the smallest number which can be expressed as the sum of two different cubes in two different ways, I would have to check you on that. I don't have the immediate math background to confirm or deny that claim. I would have to do some sort of investigating. In this case, that investigating would lead me to the conclusion that that is a true claim. This is what I call the counting response, because you verify the claim by doing your own sort of investigation. In Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism, in all cases where doubt arises, the counting response is always the favored response. Why? Because the counting response is always an investigation into the true nature of reality in some way. That means that anytime you seek to verify, your motivation is, knowingly or unknowingly, to come to some intimate knowledge of the true nature of the world around you. Thus, doubt can represent a cause for wholesome action. As we've said dozens of times on this show, that is one of the core goals and motivations for meditation and study of the sutras, to understand the nature of the world around you. Remember that in Buddhism, the Buddha's Dharma is regarded as being universally true, the true nature of reality. He repeatedly says that he didn't make any of it up himself. He simply penetrated into knowledge of the capital D Dharma through meditation and insight, and argues that we can and should do so as well.
I suspect this kind of framing of doubt is a pretty significant factor in previous episodes where we were talking about secular Buddhism, Buddhist modernism in previous episodes. This sounds like something that a Westerner could look at and go, see, what they're doing is science, not religion.
This is absolutely true. The encouragement of investigation in this Buddhist sense is often misunderstood as investigation in the scientific sense. As I mentioned before with the issue of the fallibility of our senses, the idea of verifiability or falsifiability kind of goes almost entirely out the window, becomes a lot more problematic. The scientific method relies heavily on results or premises or anything that is observable, and that observation is given priority as being the highest level of knowing something because you saw it happen, because you can make it happen in front of you over and over again in the same way. But in Buddhism, if we're unenlightened, then our senses, the things that we can perceive, all of it is insufficient. All of it is not quite there yet. It's very similar to Plato's philosophy in that sense. There's the world of senses and the world of forms in Plato, right? The world of forms is not fully captured by our five senses. The world of forms is larger than the world of the senses. And in Buddhism, similarly, if you're unenlightened, you can't see the true nature of reality in an obvious and verifiable way unless you practice and meditate and study. And by doing so, you're not making something up or changing reality around you. You're actually revealing the real world to yourself, to your own senses. because your senses can't see it in the current state. You have to purify your senses to be able to see it. In addition to this, there's also an entire flip side to doubt as well. Just as it can be a cause for wholesome action, so too can it be the result of wholesome action. How could something wholesome and good cause a state of mind that is typically unwholesome? While doubt can be a symptom of lack of faith or lack of trust, it can also be a symptom of the existence of faith or trust. This is what a lot of elementary level Zen meditation points at. If you meditate investigatively on something mundane, the Buddha argues that you will likely find what he found. You will find that it is marked by impermanence, emptiness, and dukkha. Why does the Buddha argue that this is what we will find? Well, 1, those are universal and evident conditions of reality. 2, the instinct or the inclination of sentient beings in their default state is to seek total and permanent existence and satisfactoriness. So when they meditate at the elementary level, even if they don't have direct or verifiable knowledge one way or the other, they are biased to look for that. The inclination causes them to stumble headfirst into dukkha. When you look for permanence, real true existence, or satisfactoriness, it simply is not there. The realization is said to cause one to doubt the world around them piece by piece. When one experiences emptiness, impermanence, or dukkha, they don't realize or understand it totally and all at once. They meditate on the body, and they realize that the body is impermanent, is non-self, and is prone to dukkha. But they may think that there is still a higher reality out there. This higher reality could be Brahma, God, or any number of things. However, having verified to themselves through meditative investigation that the body is impermanent, non-self, and prone to dukkha, that might/should cause one to doubt that Brahma, God, or anything else is free from an impermanence, non-self, and being prone to dukkha. This causes a larger domino effect in all directions, where one starts to doubt that anything at all in conventional experiential reality is free from these characteristics. Thus, the great doubt is the doubt that the whole world around us is permanent, free from emptiness, and free from dukkha. This doubt is extremely wholesome and positive in Buddhism, but only if it leads to the counting response. If it leads to the counting response, then it causes the practitioner to be motivated to turn over every single rock and leaf and see what's under there. In other words, it fuels meditative investigation. However, it can also lead to very unwholesome states of mind as well. I'm sure that many of you out there have heard of Zen sickness. This is one of the pitfalls of meditation or meditative investigation. It is when one's doubt becomes so all-encompassing and complete that it becomes mentally and emotionally paralyzing and causes symptoms that appear like anxiety and depression or even panic. When someone experiences something like emptiness or dukkha to a degree that is beyond their practical capacity, then they can be psychologically damaged by the experience. When one's entire existence is biased toward this proclivity or this desire for something, in this case permanence, when they realize in a huge way that reality is totally and completely dissatisfactory in that way, it can shake one to their core, akin to a spiritual death. It can be so psychologically powerful that it can cause physical symptoms. Zen master Hakuin, who lived in the 17th and 18th centuries in Japan, wrote on his own experience with Zen sickness, saying, quote, "Before the month was out, my heart fire began to rise upward against the natural course, parching my lungs of their essential fluids. My feet and legs were always ice cold. They felt as though they were immersed in tubs of snow. There was a constant buzzing in my ears, as if I were walking beside a raging mountain torrent. I became abnormally weak and timid, shrinking and fearful in whatever I did. I felt totally drained, physically and mentally exhausted. Strange visions appeared to me during waking and sleeping hours alike. My armpits were always wet with perspiration. My eyes watered constantly. I traveled far and wide, visiting wise Zen teachers, seeking out noted physicians, but none of the remedies they offered brought me any relief." Unquote. This Zen sickness was only cured when Hakuin received a visualization meditation practice from a reclusive master living in a mountain in Kyoto. Zen sickness is not a guaranteed result of meditative investigation, but it is something to be aware of when dealing with the great doubt.
How ought one cultivate the great doubt?
This is a highly favored state of mind, but there is no set and prescribed means of cultivating it. It is something that can strike or something that can be chased down and attained through practice. Because it is this vague and generalized experience of doubt in the completeness or the substantiality of reality around us, knowing about it is not necessarily enough. It is an experience wherein you look around you, and because your consciousness has fundamentally changed, you don't see what you might have seen before. In that sense, fundamentally changing your perspective on the world around you is the most common means of experiencing the great doubt. That should not be taken to mean that meditation does not work. In fact, a consistent means of attaining it, of course, is still meditative investigation. To cultivate the great doubt that way, the procedure is to pick an object of meditation, which can be categorized as a small d dharma, and consider the nature of that object of meditation. The example I used earlier of the body is a great object of meditation. You can meditate on the non-self nature of the body, the impermanence of the body, and the unsatisfactoriness of the body. This can tip over the first domino toward the great doubt. The body is not the only object of meditation that will lead toward the great doubt. When the meditation is performed properly, any object of meditation will lead toward it.
So, 2 words there that were very important that I want to poke at. Any object and will lead.
Yeah, so the question is, can you meditate on anything, and then will it necessarily lead to an experience or a mindset of the great doubt? And the answer is yes. If you do the meditation correctly, and you understand the object first in the conventional sense, and then through this meditation in a different sense, then yes. There will be varying levels of results for varying practitioners, but essentially, ideally, if you meditate correctly on anything at all, including, but not limited to, physical objects in the world, but also concepts, ideas, arguments, language itself, on feelings and emotions, even memories or past lives, or the Buddha's Dharma itself. If you meditate on emptiness, impermanence, and dukkha, even, you'll find that you come to a better understanding, and perhaps it will lead to a great doubt about the rest of the world. There are certain things out there, of course, that are regarded as universal, such as emptiness, impermanence, and dukkha themselves. But if you meditate on those correctly, that should lead you to a great doubt for everything else in the world, which is not universal, which is not regarded as being a characteristic of everything. So anything, if meditated on properly, will lead to an experience of the great doubt. Now I would like to fold faith or trust back into the conversation. I mentioned it earlier and sort of left it behind, and now would be a good time to diagnose the role that Shraddha has in this scheme. The surprising answer is that faith does not help one attain great doubt at all. Shraddha in Buddhism is based entirely on experiential knowledge, even if the experience took place in another lifetime. Remember that our orientation toward the world around us and to the capital D Dharma is relative to what has been going on in our past lives. So faith or trust is, in part, the result of previous wholesome actions and experiences. Thus, the presence of Shraddha necessitates the possibility that even if you haven't experienced the truth of the capital D Dharma in this lifetime, it could have happened in your past sometime. Because this knowledge is experiential, that means that the presence of Shraddha is said to indicate that you have already experienced the great doubt and engaged in some sort of investigation in the past. In our conventional Judeo-Christian schemes, we think of faith as a cure to doubt or an absence of doubt. However, in Buddhism, it is the direct result of engaging in the counting response to doubt. The argument is that if you have Shraddha in the capital D Dharma, you already have surpassed the great doubt step. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do any practice at all, though. In fact, it means the opposite. But it does not relate to this doubt in the way that we would commonly think it would relate to it in the West.
The step of directly engaging with the counting response, the investigation of a subject, to me, that is the step that differentiates between trust and faith, like the words trust and faith. You've done some investigation, you have gathered your evidence, you have some reason to believe the things that you are believing or come to the conclusions that you've come to. So, to me, that is no longer faith. But this is also probably me arguing semantics in a way that's perhaps not that useful. It's important to me, but that's a distinction that I'm not sure would translate to others.
Well, it is important to be mindful of one's own assumptions behind the word faith. You've got, it sounds like a very blind faith or a very perhaps Judeo-Christian faith mindset about that word in particular. And then it seems to be faith in the absence of trust or confidence or experience. And then the word trust does kind of capture faith plus confidence and experience. And Shraddha is supposed to capture all of those in the same sort of definition, but it leaves out the blind faith, which is, as I said before, the willful assertion that something is the case, even in the absence of evidence that it is the case, or even in evidence to the contrary that it is the case. Shraddha does not capture all of that. It captures the not knowing and then also the trusting because you have some experience there.
For me, it's more of a semantic distinction, I think. It's not just that the way Christians use the word, it's the definition of the word faith, as I've always used it, has included a lack or scarcity of evidence. The more evidence that is available, the less it is faith and the more it is trust.
Yeah.
In the way I've always used the word.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And in this Shraddha scheme, the way that you get more evidence is you have to seek it out yourself. You have to, regardless of if you believe that it is there or not, you have to create an opportunity, a cause or a condition for yourself to find it and experience it. And that slowly cements Shraddha. Shraddha is thought of as a process as much as it is a mindset. It's something that can be perfected through experience and practice, which is, like you say, turning it from faith to trust, even to like confidence that something is going to be the case. I think that the next step after trust is going to be confidence, because trust is sort of like, in my view, this idea that you have like invested emotionally, this sort of idea that something's going to happen the same way. But confidence is like, there's no risk involved or very little risk involved that it won't come out that way. So it's not as much trust as it is like confidence that C comes after A and B. Before we move on, I feel I should mention some means of preventing Zen sickness. Zen sickness can be regarded as the unintended result of seeking for awakening too hard or too fast. This can be prevented or mitigated by slowing down and being forgiving in your practice. It is entirely possible that one's intellectual knowledge supersedes their experiential knowledge when it comes to the practice of the Dharma. I like to believe this is my situation, being a scholar of Buddhism, but not being a monk. Excessive intellectual knowledge is dangerous because we make the false connection that intellectual knowledge is connected to the fundamental orientation of our consciousness toward the world around us. That is not at all the case according to Buddhism. While we may know that the Dharma is what it is and may even choose to believe it, that is reflective of something positive in our karmic situation, but it doesn't mean that we are any closer to enlightenment than the next person. One can be very intellectual in the Dharma and still have an orientation toward reality that is not free of bias toward capital S self and permanence and so on. So when somebody practices beyond their capacity because they intellectually know how it works, they can easily fall into Zen sickness. Remember that Zen sickness is the result of your entire psychological frame getting torn off or shifted in some significant way. And so calcified intellectual knowledge that we mistake as being a properly oriented perspective opens us up to the danger of getting Zen sick. So preventing it means doing meditative practices which are not necessarily so pointedly investigative, but instead are supportive of your body and mind in their current state. This could include calmness meditation, loving kindness and compassion meditation, etc. You can also switch to ritual, such as almsgiving, recitation, or offerings to the Buddha. These are not designed to shift your entire frame of mind and perception, and thus don't put you in very much danger of experiencing Zen sickness. However, they are still open to having these experiences that are transformative. It's just not going to be such a direct result of them every time.
Why ought one cultivate the great doubt?
As we've said, this great doubt, when cultivated with a counting response, is thought of as a wholesome cause for further wholesome action, be it further investigation into the Dharma and the nature of reality itself, but also perhaps the dismantling of views of self, permanence, desire, and so on. It is important to know that Buddhist practice is typically a cycle of continual deconstruction, construction, and re-deconstruction. You're constantly dismantling your views and beliefs, constantly rejecting conceptions, notions, and delusions, and constantly attempting to complete the perfection of your practice, your knowledge, and your wisdom. You go in thinking that the mountain exists. You realize that it doesn't exist. But then you come to find that even though it doesn't exist, it is still there in front of you. This is a common metaphor for realizing the middle way. The mountain is there, the mountain is not there, the mountain is there again, but not the same as it was before. Because of the nature of causality in the Buddhist scheme, repetition, in the truest sense of the word, is literally impossible. So even if the mountain comes back, it doesn't come back in the same way that it was there before because it can't. It comes back, but you are wiser for knowing that it was not there in the way you thought it was in the first place. That is why cultivating great doubt is such a beneficial and important practice. When we say an experience is life-changing, we think it has to be very dramatic and huge and meaningful in scale or impact. Experiencing the great doubt and seeing the impact of that experience is said to be one of the most impactful and life-changing things a person can do. It is transformative in the journey of realizing the Eightfold Path and reaching enlightenment. The Buddha himself is thought to have properly cultivated the great doubt and seen the experience through. His renunciation of the palace and his royal position was due to having seen the four sights and suddenly feeling doubt about himself and the world around him. He began to doubt that he would have his healthy body forever. He began to doubt that a life of sensory and material indulgences were productive means of reckoning with aging, illness, and death. And he began to doubt that the world worked the way that his father had led him to believe in his father's great desire to protect and shelter his son. Thus, when we look at the Buddha's life narratively, we are led to the interpretation that the cultivation of the great doubt is the starting point on a trajectory which ends with enlightenment, Buddhahood, and nirvana. This path or trajectory is not one that you can remove yourself from once you're on it. Once this path starts, whether it takes 30 minutes or 30 lifetimes or 30 mahakalpas, it will conclude with enlightenment, Buddhahood, and nirvana. That is the meaning of entering the state of non-regression, something we've seen many times in the sutras that we've read and discussed. It seems like it is almost a trap, like you're locked into something whether you like it or not. But that's not how it's presented in Buddhism. It's more like you have accrued enough good karma through encountering the Buddha's teaching that you have reached a tipping point where you can no longer be reborn in a worse state than the one you're in now. Thus, experiencing the great doubt is not like getting on a roller coaster without being allowed to get off. It actually is more like one of a person's crowning achievements in a long series of increasingly positive achievements. It represents the realization of a great deal of wisdom, of practice, and of merit.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of the great doubt in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss the paramitas. What are the paramitas in Buddhism? How ought one cultivate them? How do understandings of them change over time? We hope to see you there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.